Today, Professor David Whiteman will speak to you about what we can do to help reduce our risk of cancer using the evidence from fairly new research. David Whiteman is a medical epidemiologist and Senior Principal Research Fellow at the Queensland Institute of Medical Research in Brisbane, where he studies the causes, diagnosis, prevention and treatment of cancer. In addition to his research activities, he is a member of the Academy of the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, the NHMRC, the National Research Advisory Committee for Cancer Australia, the Research Committees of Cure Cancer Australia Foundation and Wesley Research Institute, and the Fellowships Committee of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. He's the chair of the Barrett's Neoplasia Guidelines Committee for the Cancer Council Australia. In 2006, he was awarded a Fulbright Scholarship to visit cancer researchers in the United States, and in 2009 was awarded a Future Fellowship from the Australian Research Council. Cancer Council WA thanks Professor David Whiteman for his support and is delighted to have David here for the Cancer Council Update 2015. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Whiteman.
Thanks, Steve, for those very kind words. I'll just get my talk up on the screen and then rejoin the conversation. So I'd like to echo Steve's welcome to you all, and it's a great pleasure for me to be standing before you and talking about the thing that I feel very passionate about, and that's how to prevent cancer. And I guess on the eve of World Cancer Day, it's sobering to reflect how many people in our community are afflicted by cancer. And so today's message is one not focusing on cure, but focusing on prevention. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you may have learned a couple of new facts. So the outline of my talk, it's going to be about 40 to 45 minutes, unless I ramble, because I sometimes do, but I'll try not to. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what cancer is. I think people come with very different understandings about what cancer actually is. So I want to bring everyone up to the same level of knowledge so that we're talking about the same things. Prevention is also a term that's used in different ways by different people, and I would like to just tell you what I mean by prevention in this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that cause cancer, because you've got to know what those things are in order to prevent cancer. And then I'm going to leave you with some work from one of our esteemed colleagues in the US, who's actually originally an Australian, on his messages for 8 ways to prevent cancer. And it's a very succinct message, and so I'll leave you with that at the end. And then very happy to take any questions that you might have. So what is cancer? It's a term that's used by all of us in everyday language. It's important to understand cancer is not a single disease. I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but it's actually a process. It's a pathological process. So up on the slide here, I've got some images of what a pathologist sees when he or she looks under the microscope at different organs of the body. And I think one of the things that's really striking, even for us as lay people out there, or for you as lay people, I should know this stuff, is that all of these organs look very different. They have a very particular pattern. So the thyroid gland in here, in our neck, regulates a lot of our metabolism. The skin is our barrier against the outside world. Our bowel helps to absorb nutrients from the outside world. These tissues have very specific roles in the body, and the cells that comprise those tissues are under very ordered and regular control. Now, what happens in cancer is that these cells lose their ability to protect themselves, and they lose their ordered way of going about their business. So when you look under the microscope, that nice, regular, ordered pattern that you see in each of the tissues is changed. It's broken down, and the cells have this unconstrained growth. They misbehave, they replicate strangely, and the tissues tend to grow. And so you can see that there's this chaotic pattern of cancer compared with the normal state. So how does this arise? Well, it all goes back to the way our bodies replicate ourselves. So every day we're undergoing a process whereby our cells are replenishing each of themselves. So we have what we call a mother cell, and typically in cell division, the cell breaks into 2 identical daughter cells that are the same as the original mother cell. So when we replace our skin or our bowel, that's happening all the time. Now, every so often, mistakes happen, because in that process of producing 2 copies, mistakes happen. It's a very intricate process. Sometimes this happens randomly, Sometimes it happens because of other agents out there in the environment. So a classical example would be sunlight. Whenever we go out into the sun, the UV rays bombard our skin, and every single day we are acquiring mutations in the cells of our skin. Fortunately, our body often repairs those, mostly it repairs them, and we go on and live a normal life. But if it doesn't get repaired, then what happens is that the daughters of that daughter cell carry that mutation forward to the next generation. So that means that mutation is fixed. Now, that doesn't mean you've got cancer. It doesn't mean that you even have a high risk of cancer. This is a very common occurrence that we have mutations in our cells. But what can happen over time is that a cell that carries one mutation, when it divides again, can acquire a second mutation. And then those cells are a bit more unstable because the DNA within those cells may not repair itself quite as efficiently as a completely healthy, perfect cell. So over the course of years, our cells can acquire more and more layers of mutations. Now, this is when things start to become interesting because that's when cells start to misbehave a little bit more than they ought. And so this diagram shows you here what's happening in cells that have acquired some mutation. So that second panel shows you normal cells. This would be in the skin. So those little rectangles up there with the little circle dots in them are the normal healthy cells of the skin. You can see that in the second panel you've got some abnormal cells. They would be cells carrying mutations. Now, many of us in Australia, particularly in Western Australia, would be carrying lots of cells with these abnormal mutations already. Many of us would be carrying them all the time. I certainly would be, and I'm sure many of you would be as well. Now, what can happen is those abnormal cells, they're still not cancers. They're sort of pre-cancers. And those cells, though, they can multiply and form little bumps on our skin. Many of us will have sunspots or solar keratoses or funny little moles. That's what they are. They're abnormal cells that have aggregated. And this can happen in other organs of the body. This happens in the bowel, in the lung, in the thyroid, in the kidney, in the liver. This can be happening anywhere. When it becomes a problem is when those abnormal cells then lose the restraint on staying in one place. They can then burrow into the deeper structures, burrow into the blood system or the lymph supply, and then spread to other parts of the body and seed those other parts of the body. That's when we talk about secondaries or metastatic cancer. And that's typically how a cancer will end up killing its host. We think of cancer as a parasite, that it is serving its own ends, overtakes the body and kills the host. So that's the process of cancer development, and it can take decades. Usually does take decades. That's why cancer is a disease that's more common as we age. So that's a bit of background about what cancer is. Many different diseases, takes a long time to develop in the main. Why is cancer important? Well, it inflicts a huge toll on our society. So these are data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, just breaking down our burden of disease. So this is a way of capturing the amount of suffering in the community. It's a sort of complicated mathematical measure, but it combines the number of people who die from a disease, that is, die prematurely from a disease, but it also integrates the amount of suffering that people have. So if somebody develops a disease at a point in their life, say at the age of 50, and their life expectancy was 75 years, they'd be living with that disease, usually, for 25 years. And they might have a compromised quality of life. So this measure takes into account suffering and death. Cancers impose the highest burden on the Australian population. Now, these data are a few years old now. Everyone's expectation is when this exercise is repeated, that the burden of cancer will be even larger. So it's overtaken heart disease, which is what Australians used to suffer from in extraordinarily high numbers. Now, when you just look at deaths from diseases in the Australian population, cancer now accounts for about a third of all deaths in our population. So it's very sobering. Again, it's now greater than cardiovascular disease, strokes and heart attacks, those sorts of things. So a very common and debilitating set of conditions. So how do we compare internationally? So these are figures from the International Agency on Research on Cancer, based in Lyon in France. It's an organisation under the World Health Organization. They capture cancer statistics from all countries and all regions in the world. So it's a very busy graph. I'm sorry to laden it with so much data. But basically it's breaking up the world's populations into Australia, New Zealand, North America, Western Europe, all the way down to the populations of Middle Africa. And the bars show you how much cancer is in those countries per 100,000 people. So it's a way of looking at per capita cancer incidence. Very sorry to see that Australia has the highest overall rate of cancers in the world. So it's a very sobering statistic. Now, in part, that's our lifestyle. A proportion of that is also due to us living in a high UV environment. So part of the reason our rates are higher than America or Europe, which we might compare ourselves with, is because of melanoma, the burden of melanoma. And this doesn't include other kinds of skin cancers. So a very sobering statistic. We have a very high rate of cancer in international terms. A more optimistic statistic is the fact that for people who are diagnosed with cancer, we actually have very good survival rates. In fact, if you look at this figure, we have about the best in the world. This is another complicated graph showing the same breakdown of countries and populations as before. But this is comparing the number of people who die from cancer each year with the number of people who develop cancer. And so what this is saying is that if you draw your eye across to the axis over there, for every 10 people in Australia that are diagnosed with cancer, about 3 people die from cancer in the same year. And you can see that our rates are actually much lower than other countries around the world, even other advanced economies like Western Europe and North America. So the bad thing is we get a lot of cancer. The good thing is when people develop cancer, this is the best place in the world to be. So some bittersweet messages there. Just to show you that cancer rates in Australia have been rising relentlessly for the last 3 decades. So we keep in Australia very accurate statistics on the diagnosis of cancer in every state and territory. Back to 1982, up until the present day, these figures are a few years old. But you can see over 25 years of data. If you look at the grey column, that's the number of men diagnosed each year with cancer. The yellow column is the number of women. So men always get cancer at higher rates than women. We always see that in Australia. Good reasons for that, and we can talk about that. So that's the numbers of cancer, but of course our population keeps rising. So that those lines there, the grey and the yellow line, are the rates of cancer. So taking 100,000 people every year, how many of them would get cancer? That's over on this other bar on the side here. So about 600 men per year per 100,000 Australians would develop cancer issues. So you can see the rates have been rising over time. But death rates from cancer have been falling. So again, this is the part of that success story I talked about a little bit earlier. Australian rates of mortality from cancer have been declining. So that's really all that graph is to show you. So what are the cancers that afflict Australians? So this is for men. So you can see here's the top 10 cancers. This is Australia-wide. It's pretty much the same for every state and territory. Prostate cancer, overwhelmingly the most common cancer in men. So in Australia each year about 20,000 men are newly diagnosed with prostate cancer. But you can see also high rates of melanoma, lung cancer, colorectal cancer, cancer of the bowel, when you add those together, kidney cancer, bladder cancer. And that UPS is unknown primary site. So it's quite common that people present to hospital with advanced metastatic cancer and none of us can say where that cancer, which organ it originated in. That's a very sobering statistic, that one, because if you don't know where the cancer comes from, it's very hard to have a preventive program directed at it. So they're the cancers for men. Cancers for women, breast cancer the most common, and then colon cancer, skin cancer, lung cancer, and endometrial cancer and thyroid. So a different mix of cancers for women as compared to men. So it's important to bear in mind when you're talking about prevention. And just a couple of little final graphs. I don't want to bore you with graphs, but just to show you that underneath these overall statistics, there's a lot of complexity in this, and this is the things that the cancer councils and the health departments monitor very closely to look at trends in the development of cancer in populations. This is a graph showing prostate cancer for men in the green or blue, I can't quite see, and the yellow there is breast cancer. Just looking at rates of cancer over the past 30-odd years, you can see there's a big blob, big spike for prostate cancer. And that's when prostate screening, de facto prostate screening, prostate-specific antigen testing became very popular in the early 1990s. And that led to the discovery of a huge reservoir of cancer, this previously undiagnosed pool of patients who had prostate cancer suddenly came to clinical attention because they'd been tested for it and found a cancer that was never going to kill them or even cause them disease or morbidity but a lot of cancer was discovered. And you can see that dropped away again when GPs started using these tests in a sort of more considered fashion. So there's a lot of debate and controversy about these figures. I don't want to open up a hornet's nest today, but just to show you that cancer rates can do funny things over time depending on clinical practice. When we look at bowel cancer rates have been relatively stable in Australia. This is for melanoma, for men and for women. You can see that rates have been rising steadily over the past 30 years in Australia, starting off at about 30 per 100,000 back in the 80s, and now around 60 to 70 per 100,000 in men, so a doubling of melanoma rates. And this is the one that's always confronting. This is lung cancer. So you can see for men have quit smoking largely or have given up smoking at a faster rate than women. So rates of lung cancer are coming down in men. Oh, we've got a phone call. But unfortunately, you can see that for women, in that yellow line, rates of lung cancer are continuing to rise. So this is a mixed message. So again, just to show you that underneath these cancer statistics, there is complexity and there are different stories for different cancers. So lung cancer is a classical example of where we know what the risk factor is. We've taken great steps to mitigate the risks of that risk factor, but you're still seeing differences in men and women in the way that risk factor is displaying itself. So just wanted to make that point. So that's the background to cancer, telling you what cancer is and how common it is in our community. So what do we use the term prevention to actually mean? So the best way to illustrate that I've found is to illustrate my life, your life, everyone's life on a timeline. Over on the far side there, the moment of birth, at the end of the line, unfortunately, where we all get off at the end of the line. So unfortunately, some of us will develop a cancer at some point in our life. And that could happen in our 40s, our 50s, or our 60s, or earlier or later. But it's often the case, in fact, that the diagnosis of that cancer occurs at some period well after the cancer has been detectable, when it's arisen in the body. So when we talk about prevention, there are different strategies for doing this. That's just to overlay the acquisition of cancer with that biological model. So when we talk about preventing cancer from occurring in the first place, that's called primary prevention. And that's where we try and stop people being exposed to the things that cause cancer. So that might be smoking, sunlight, poor diet. And that's intended to stop the onset of cancer in the first place, to stop those mutations being arising in the cells. The period between the onset of cancer and the diagnosis of cancer is a point at which we try and do early detection. We try and pick up cancers at an early stage before they've caused ill health or symptoms. And that's secondary prevention. That's all revolving around screening and early detection. And then the final stage, which I won't be talking about today, is tertiary prevention. We're trying to prevent premature death from cancer. So trying to, even when people have been diagnosed with cancer, trying to stop people dying or having a poor quality of life. And so today's talk is really going to be focused on primary prevention and a little bit about secondary prevention. So that's the jargon I'm going to use here today. So in order to practice primary prevention, you have to be able to identify what causes cancer. And if you read the newspapers, it seems like everything causes cancer. And, I think we know a lot of the culprits. So when my kids were younger and they had no idea what I did, I tried to explain it to them using a children's book. It's a book that many of you would know, I think. It's called Who Sank the Boat? It's by an Australian author called Pamela Allen. And if you ever have children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews and you're trying to explain to them causal reasoning, this is the book for you. So this is the story of 5 friends, a cow, a donkey, a sheep, a pig, and a little mouse. And they decide to go out one day for a row on a boat on a lake. And the recurring question in this book is, who sank the boat? And no matter how many times my kids heard this story, they always said, I don't know, Dad, who sank the boat? So off these friends would go. They went down to the end of the jetty. First of all, the cow got in and the boat tipped and rocked, but the boat didn't sink. Who sank the boat? One by one, all the friends piled into the boat, the sheep, the pig, the cow, the donkey. They all got in. The boat hasn't sunk. Lastly, the little mouse comes running down the jetty, dives off the end, and the kids are just anticipating this event that's going to happen. And of course, the boat sinks. So when you ask a little kid who sank the boat, they always say, the mouse sank the boat, Dad. And you say, well, what would happen if the mouse had got in the boat first? Would the boat have sunk then? No, Dad, no, it wouldn't have. So what do you think sank the boat? Oh, it was everything in there together. And so I hope you'll, forgive me for this long bow, but we've gone from a scene of order and serenity and a perfect world into this scene of chaos and, tumultuous upset. And it's very similar to what we see in cancer. There's the neat, tidy thyroid going about its business, being very ordered. There's a thyroid cancer, complete chaos. And so who sank the boat is a perfect metaphor for this scenario. And it teaches us a few things. It's almost definitely the case that every cancer that arises has multiple causes. It's a multiple-step pathway. Multiple things have fallen and broken down in that cell's biology to cause cancer. So it's not just one cause for every cancer. The other thing is that causes of cancer can act at different times in a person's life. So sometimes you need a critical event to happen early in a person's life, and after that, other exposures will happen until that cancer occurs. So it means that if you're going to prevent cancer, you have to intervene at the right time. So, you might want to put life jackets on those animals, or you might want to get a bigger boat, or more stability, or don't build the jetty, park the boat somewhere else. But there's many different things you can do to stop that event unfolding. And also the classic trap is that the most obvious cause that you've identified in your cancer research may not have the biggest effect. It may not be the most important thing. It might be a small player like the mouse that comes right at the end that you discover, but it may not be the thing that you should target. Leaving the mouse off the boat may not have made much difference, actually, in the long run, and having a better boat with better seats and a bigger stowage might have helped. So that's pushing the metaphor all the way to the end, but you can see what I mean. It's a useful way of thinking about it. So when we talk about the causes of cancer in general, there are things that we know about in the environment that cause the target cell, the cell in any part of the body, to start misbehaving and to form cancer. So there are some things that we just can't do anything about. There are host factors. As we get older, our DNA repair systems work less well, unfortunately. Our sex, our gender, determines which cancers we will and won't get. And our genetic environment, the genes that we inherit, at the moment there's nothing we can do about those, really, in terms of primary prevention. We can do some secondary prevention, but we can't do much about the genes we inherit at this point in time. So we're really focusing on those things that are out there that influence us in the environment. So in general, we're talking about those toxins or carcinogens in the environment, smoking, alcohol, diet. I'm going to talk about these in a bit more detail in a second. But I just wanted to touch on an issue that got a lot of press recently. Some scientists in the US made a claim that 2/3 of cancer is completely random and we should just try and give up on preventing cancer. So to those scientists I say, no thanks, not today. There's plenty more we can do, and I think your numbers are wrong anyway. So we can talk about that. This has got a storm of controversy in the scientific literature, but just in case you're aware of that story and you thought you'd give up on trying to prevent cancer, please don't. So what do we know about the causes of cancer? Well, as I said, the International Agency for Research on Cancer is the authority on cancer research around the world, and they compile every year lists of the things in the environment that cause cancer. And so this list gets added to routinely. And so in terms of so a lot of the things out there that don't really affect us in our day-to-day life, there are carcinogens used, in particular industrial processes, that if you are exposed to them, they are highly toxic and dangerous. But we're interested in the things that we get exposed to on a daily basis. What are they? So this is the list basically determined by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. There's a second list on another slide, but these are the ones on the first list. So alcohol, an accepted carcinogen. Tobacco, a carcinogen. Obesity, a carcinogen. Components of diet, that is, not eating enough fibre. Eating too much red and processed meat. Inadequate fruit, inadequate vegetables, and UV radiation. This is just list one. Which cancers have they been declared to be causes of? Well, the lists are long. Okay, so I won't read through all of them, but you can see that for alcohol and tobacco, it's mostly the cancers of the upper airways, the mouth, the throat, the upper pharynx, and then for lung cancer, for tobacco smoke, it's the lungs as well. But you'll be interested to see that for alcohol, there is a causal association with bowel cancer, that's colon and rectum, liver cancer, and in women, breast cancer. These are declared causal relationships. So these are relatively new information and not widely appreciated. Alcohol is a carcinogen. Obesity is the other one I'm going to talk about a bit later on, a known causal factor for a range of cancers. And then the second list, insufficient duration of breastfeeding, a cause of breast cancer. Use of the oral contraceptive pill transiently raises the risk of breast and cervical cancer for women while they're taking it, but actually has a benefit as well. The oral contraceptive pill dramatically reduces the risk of endometrial cancer and ovarian cancer. So you can see there's a lot of research that's been done looking at these things. I'm not going to go into all of it in detail, but I'm happy to talk about it if people have questions. But what we have been doing with the Cancer Council over the last couple of years is trying to estimate, well, how much cancer in Australia is caused by Australians being exposed to these agents that have been declared as carcinogens. So we haven't actually published these data yet, so you can't tell anybody what the answers are, okay? You have to promise me that you won't tell. We're submitting this for publication. We've told the Cancer Council this is under embargo. Just want to make that really clear. In fact, well, we can talk about that. So just looking at the numbers, crunching the numbers, and these estimates come about based on how many Australians are currently smoking or are ex-smokers, how many Australians eat an adequate diet. There's lots of calculations and data underlying all of these things. But you can see that tobacco in Australia estimated to cause about 13% of all cancers. Radiation, UV radiation, about 6% of all cancers. Now they're only doing this by causing specific kinds of cancer, but this is just estimating the total proportion of all cancers that could be eliminated if we eliminated exposure to these factors. So you can see that dietary factors, we estimate, contribute about 6% overall to the cancer burden. Overweight and obesity, about 3%. Infections, about 3%. So I'm going to talk a little bit about overweight and obesity because it's probably not widely appreciated in the general community that this condition causes cancer. So we know that Australians over the last couple of decades have become heavier. Many of us are carrying excess pounds. Mostly this is in the form of fat, either around the waist, particularly in men, or the thighs and hips in women. Turns out that mostly the male distribution of obesity is the really bad kind, unfortunately, for the men in the audience. The sort of classical beer belly is where we're finding a lot of side effects or adverse effects. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of data, but to understand it, you have to understand what this concept is, the body mass index or BMI. Now, many of you, when you visit your GP, he or she might get you to stand on the scales, measure your height, and tell you what your BMI is. So the BMI is a calculation. It's an index that tries to put you on a scale of healthy weight, overweight, or obese. And you can calculate it yourself at home if you want to. You take your weight in kilograms, and you get your height in metres. So if you're 1.75 metres and you weigh 90 kilos, then you do 90 divided by 1.75 squared. And that will give you your BMI. So to make it easier and to illustrate it, I've done a few maths calculations here for you. So for a person who's 1.8 metres tall, if you weigh somewhere between 65 and 78 kilos, your BMI will be somewhere between 20 and 24. You'll be in the healthy weight range. If you weigh 80 to 94 kilos, your BMI will be in that 25 to 29 range, so-called overweight. And then if you're 97 or greater, you're in the obese category. Okay, so it's actually very surprising how few Australians are in the healthy weight range. About 30% of adult Australians, 35% of adult Australians are in the healthy weight range. Most of the rest are overweight or obese. A very small proportion of people are actually in the sort of underweight category. There's an underweight category, less than 18.5. So why is this important? Well, about 10 years ago, a landmark paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the sort of prestige, premier international journal, showing for the first time very strong evidence. They'd followed up 1.5 million Americans who'd been enrolled in a huge study. It had run for 15 years. They were mostly looking at heart disease and things like that, but when they crunched the numbers and looked at the rates of cancer, according to people's BMI, when they were recruited to the study, found this somewhat shocking result, that the rates of all cancers were about 52% higher. That's what these numbers mean here. They're plotting out the increased risks of cancer for people who are obese. And so as the numbers get above 1, it means that there's a positive increase in risk. And as you come down to liver cancer, 4.52. So that means people who are obese have a 4.5-fold higher risk of liver cancer compared to people who are not obese. So this was a bit of a revelation and unexpected and not previously understood. So this has opened the door to a huge amount of research. First of all, to replicate these findings, because you can't believe every paper that you read. They might have made a mistake. They might have crunched the numbers wrong. Every study that's been done subsequently has replicated these findings. So a lot of research now underpins this statement. So how does body fat cause cancer? Well, it turns out there's lots of different ways. We used to think that body fat was just, blubber, if you like, didn't do anything that could affect cells in the body. How wrong we were. So the last 10 or 15 years has shown a huge amount of activity of fat cells in the body. They're highly inflammatory. They pump out lots of hormones. They talk to other cells in all sorts of different ways. So it turns out when you carry a lot of extra weight, and particularly this abdominal weight around the waist, your body's getting a lot of new messages that it didn't get before. So for one way that it does it, these fat cells produce a lot of hormones, female sex hormones, or precursors of female sex hormones that can be turned into female sex hormones. And these have effects on sex-specific organs. So the endometrium, the lining of the womb, and the breast, these cells are being switched on by fat cells in a different part of the body and making them replicate more. Whoops. That's one way of doing it. Another way is that these cells, these fat cells, are suppressing and changing the way we deal with insulin and glucose in the body. They change the way a lot of the metabolic pathways in the body are conducted. And so these tend to switch cells on, make them more likely to grow, which is like putting fertilizer onto a little cancer. So if you've got a cancer somewhere in the body that's at a couple of cell stages, then having lots of these messages flying around from fat cells can set up all sorts of conditions that are not helpful to try and eradicate cancer from the body. So, and this is just two of the main pathways. There are other pathways through which obesity causes cancer. So there's a lot of basic science underpinning these associations that we've discovered. So, why is this important? Well, it's because our Western populations are becoming heavier and fatter. So these are data from the US, plotting for you the different states of the US by the proportion of people in each state who are considered obese. So there's a colour coding on the bottom. So you can see that the bluey colours are low prevalence of obesity. As you go to 1990, more adult Americans are obese. As you go to 1995, more. 2000, you're starting to get 20% of people. As you get to 2005, in some of these American states in the South, over a third of adults are obese, and most are overweight. So it's a very sobering change in the presentation of obesity, and we can't be complacent here. The figures for Australia are almost identical to the US, so we have an overweight and obesity problem as well. So if you're trying to prevent cancer, and we already have an obese and overweight country, is it too late? Does that mean that once you're overweight or obese, that's it, your risk of cancer is always set high? Or can you intervene to lower your risk of cancer? So not much research in this area. It's a question that hasn't been answered properly. But there are ways of people losing weight, of course. You can diet and increase your activity, but there's also surgical methods that are being used increasingly. So the only really good data we have on does losing weight once you've been obese, does that reduce your risk of cancer? To answer that question, we have data from a long-running Swedish study where they had people who were all obese, and they offered them this gastric banding procedure to sort of block off food into the stomach. This is a usually very successful way of losing weight. People lose dramatic amounts of weight, at least in the short term, but often for a long period of time. So people offered either this procedure or dietary and lifestyle counselling. So they separated their analysis into two groups of people. And so those who were offered surgery and those who weren't. Now, this is for women, showing you the rate at which cancer develops in those two groups. The surgery patients who almost all lost about 20 or 30 kilos and kept it off for a long period of time, they're that red line on the bottom. So many people still develop cancer, but they did so at a much lower rate than the people who didn't have the surgery and didn't lose weight. So a lot of problems with how this study was done. I won't go into the details of it. It's not a perfect study by any means, but it indicates that once people are obese and they lose weight, it does appear that for women at least, their risks of cancer drop down again. So that's a good news story, that weight loss might reduce your risk of cancer in the future. Unfortunately, the same result was not seen for men, but there were fewer men in the study. The weight loss wasn't quite as successful, so there were problems in the male arm of the trial, but it's sobering to think that it may not work in men. We just don't know the answer. We need better studies and longer follow-up. So this is being followed actively right now. So the advice would be it's best not to get obese or overweight in the first place, but if you do, then losing weight, there's some hope that would lower your risk of cancer in the future. So I'm just going to close out now with a summary of what you can do to prevent cancer based on current research knowledge. I'm going to give you a website here that you might want to copy down. It'll be similar to the advice coming from the Cancer Council WA and the Health Department here in WA. There's no controversy in these messages. But these have been put forward by an old Brisbane boy, Graham Coldett, who used to work in Harvard on the Nurses' Health Study, one of the most prestigious studies in the world, has now gone to Washington University in St. Louis, and he is a supreme epidemiologist, and this is his bread and butter. And so he's got a fantastic website that can give you all the evidence you might want on how these things work. So they are to maintain a healthy weight. And he's got very helpful tips on how you can do this. But particularly, it's not just about our generation, it's about passing on these benefits and knowledge to the next generation. So for parents and grandparents out there, ways you can help your grandkids and kids maintain a healthy weight. So TV and computer time, screen time, can it? Encourage healthy snacking. Encourage activity during free time. Get kids out and about, sun-safe, but physically active. Exercise regularly. So this is actually a tough one because it seems that the amount of exercise you need for cancer protection benefits is actually higher than what you need to protect yourself from heart attacks. So it seems, based on the evidence, and Steve might correct me here, but you need to do puffing exercise probably for 30 to 60 minutes, 5 days a week, which is a lot. It's a lot of exercise, a lot of puffing. But that's where the strongest data seem to lie for cancer prevention benefits. Any exercise is good, and too much is not so good, but you need to get into that sort of puffing range and work up to it. That's how you get the benefits. Don't smoke. I don't need to say any more. Eat a healthy diet. So that's less meat in your diet if you're eating more than 65 grams a day. Little chunk of meat. More fruit and vegetables. There are guidelines in Australia for doing that. But limit the intake of fizzy drinks and processed foods and fibre. We know that insufficient fibre, contributes about 16 to 20% of all bowel cancers in Australia. So we can do a lot more with increasing fibre. And you can actually increase fibre through fruit and vegetable intake. So having those two together is a good way to go. Alcohol. So really zero risk from drinking alcohol would mean zero alcoholic drinks. That's what it means. So the best way to bring your risks down is to not drink. But there are Australian guidelines on what is considered less hazardous drinking. So for men, that's 2 standard drinks per day. For women, 1 standard drink per day. But really, if you're interested in reducing cancer risk, then the best is to drink not at all. I don't mean to sound like a wowser, by the way, but that's just what the data say. So in terms of melanoma and skin cancer, sun protection, Australians have by far the highest rates of melanoma and skin cancer in the world, cost the country hundreds of millions of dollars a year, almost entirely preventable through wise choices when out in the sun. Other things that I haven't talked about today, but we know that there are sexually transmitted infections that increase your risk of cancer. So, an Australian invention is the HPV vaccine. So we have a vaccination program for young boys and girls now, girls and boys. But also practicing safe sex that message has not changed. It's still very important to do that. And then the eighth message is to get your screening tests done. So in Australia at the moment we have mammography and pap smears for women, and we have colorectal or bowel cancer screening for men and women once they turn the age of 50. And that's doing the fecal occult blood tests. So they're the accepted screening programs. There is advice from various organisations, but not sort of formally authorised, about skin cancer screening as well. So for people who are at high risk of skin cancer, they might have a family history or an outdoor job, then those people are advised also to have skin cancer checks. But prostate cancer screening is not formally endorsed by any organisation in Australia, although there are current guidelines even now that are being worked on about how that advice might change a little. So they're the 8 ways to prevent cancer. So if we adopted those messages, how many cancers could we prevent? And Steve, I'm nearly about to finish. So this is the burden of cancer we have for the top 10 cancers in Australia. How many could we prevent? Well, we estimate overall about a third of all cancers we could surely prevent. Probably more, because our calculations were conservative. You can see here that prostate cancer, at the moment, we don't know any firm risk factors for prostate cancer. So the most common cancer in Australia in men, we can't actually do anything about in terms of prevention at this point in time, based on evidence-based knowledge. For women, they're the common cancers. How many could we prevent? In blue, again, when you add it all up, about a third of cancers. So we can prevent about a quarter of breast cancers, about a fifth of colon cancers, melanomas. We can prevent at least 50%, probably more. So you can see the numbers there. So overall, when you add it all up, about a third of all cancers we could prevent based on current knowledge. So where does this leave us? Well, this is one of my favourite paintings. It's in the Queensland Art Gallery. In the viewers' polls of that gallery in Brisbane, this is also one of the favourite paintings of all attendees of that gallery. And it's under the jacaranda tree, it's called, for obvious reasons, and it's painted in about 1903, early Edwardian times, in an era when cancer was actually much less common. Now, partly that's because people didn't live so long, but even amongst people who lived a longer age, they didn't develop cancer as often. And if you look at and study this painting, you can see why. So if you see the lady and the gentleman, they're practising sun-safe behaviour here. This is in November in Brisbane. You can date it exactly by the jacaranda tree. So at a time of high sunlight, they are appropriately dressed to prevent skin cancer. If you look at their body shapes, they're very lean, as was common at the time. No doubt they walked their way from wherever they lived into that park there. They didn't take a cab or drive their car. They would have eaten a very balanced diet, no processed foods then. They probably had a bit of salt and things, but mostly fresh fruit and vegetables, not much meat. It was expensive and went rotten in Queensland. Alcohol would have been quite abstemious in those days as well. So I don't want to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but you could wind back the clock and learn some things from these people here if you want to prevent or lower your risk of cancer. So I'll close out there. I'm very happy to take questions. I would just encourage you all to think preventatively. You can do it, and it certainly is worth the effort in trying to lower your risk of cancer. And before I finish, I just want to acknowledge a whole bunch of people that I work with at QIMR in Brisbane, some fantastic colleagues of mine who've helped over many years put all of these data together, and of course the Cancer Council for their support of our research as well. So thank you all.
We've got a microphone that's there for questions, so if someone wants to put their hand up, we've got a couple over here, Alicia. While you're heading over there, I might start with one, and I noticed on those last 2 charts you had UPS.
Oh, yeah.
Did you want to just speak about that?
Yeah, so again, UPS is that the cancers of unknown primary site. So again, these are the cancers that unfortunately people turn up to their doctor with a secondary cancer, and we don't know whereabouts in the body it started. And they remain a very stubborn group of cancers. Now, with modern molecular diagnostics, we're actually unpacking those a bit more so that the proportion of those cancers should drop, because previously the pathologist would look at it under a microscope and say, I don't know where it came from, and they would run some stains on it and say, I still don't know. Now you can use molecular techniques that will help you pinpoint the gene mutations. You can say, well, it looks like it's a pancreas, or it looks like it's a breast cancer. So over time that group probably gets smaller, but not through prevention. It'll get smaller because we can diagnose where they came from better. So it'll be an artefact.
I just wanted to ask you, you did have medication written up there, and I just meant, did you mean estrogens or?
Yes.
Oh, okay, not just normal medication.
No, so that was a very good question. So the question was how many medications cause cancer?
Yeah.
So that was those hormonal exposures that we talked about. So the oral contraceptive pill and hormone replacement therapy.
And also, what about the MRI and the CT radiation? Is that what you count there as radiation?
Brilliant question. The answer is, for that analysis, no. We tried very hard. You'll be very surprised to learn, actually, that, as I was, that we have very poor records in Australia of the numbers of people who've been exposed to X-rays and CT scans. Yeah. So each machine has a record of how many times it's been used. But for people like myself, an epidemiologist, trying to work out how many times has Mrs. Jones had a mammogram, or how many times has she also had a bone scan of her legs, and joining those together so you can get a total dose of radiation for a person, you can't do it. So one of our recommendations out of this process is to say we need better records, because we know it's a very small risk of cancer from those machines, but it's not zero. And we know that some people are exposed to much more than others. So people who work in that industry, who are radiologists, have meters and monitors, and they're okay. It's the patients that we can't count yet. So good question.
Thank you.
I noticed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, it had EBV next to it. I take it that's what I would call glandular fever, is it?
Correct.
Epstein-Barr or something?
Yes, so I didn't talk much about the viruses at all. So Epstein-Barr virus does cause glandular fever, infectious mononucleosis.
Right.
And that's when most people in the Western world acquire the infection in their sort of teenage years, and they develop, glandular fever. But at different points in a person's life, if they get infected at different points, it does appear clearly that it causes some cancers. So it's a rare outcome of this viral infection. In some parts of the world, it causes Burkitt's lymphoma, so a tumour of the face and pharynx that young children, particularly in New Guinea and Uganda, seem to get it for some reason. But in the Western world, EBV can cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma.
And just one more question. From that point, from my own situation, as a teenager, 17-year-old having that, 10 years later, I had rheumatoid arthritis. Would there be a link with that as well, or is it just that your immune system's kind of a wee bit stuffed up? It's
a very complicated area,
right,
immunology of EBV infection, and I don't study it directly, and other people who do probably couldn't give you an answer either. So it's possible, but we couldn't say for sure. Sorry to be about that.
Just a quick one. You spoke about 5 times a week for puffing, for exercise, and then you just mentioned quickly how too much is also not good. Is there a...
Yeah, look, one of the things about physical activity, it is prescribing it is not different from prescribing, in my view, prescribing a drug. So physical activity has benefits, but it also has side effects, and we often don't measure those very well, but people get muscle strains. They fall over on the footpath and break their wrists. People can bring on heart attacks. So an exercise program should not be just embarked upon and say it's only going to be good for me. People should take it slowly. So start with walking, walk more quickly, walk a bit further, walk more often, then proceed to jogging or swimming or some other low-impact thing. But I would not recommend people in their middle ages or older ages suddenly embarking on an exercise program, because it could well do more harm than good. So, all things in moderation.
Can I ask the question, what value do you see in looking at other countries and their incidence of cancer, and perhaps Japan with a different dietary approach, China with the history of rice and noodles now changing into a very Western diet. Are there lessons to learn about incidence of cancers from those different countries?
Yeah, absolutely there is. It's a huge source of research evidence, comes from comparing national distributions of cancer, also migration patterns between countries. So when migrants from one country move to another country, it can be very informative looking at the migrants themselves and their children and their grandchildren and looking at the patterns of cancer incidence. So the short answer is yes, it's incredibly informative, particularly for studies of diet, where we find it very hard to measure a person's diet, in any sort of way, because often you're relying on people's recall of what they've eaten over the past 10 years, and that can be very difficult to nail down. Whereas when you compare, like you've just mentioned, migrants from one country to another country, you can pretty safely assume their diet must change because the availability of food supplies and other things differs. And so what you're saying is true, that we often see very different patterns of cancer in migrants and in children of migrants. They tend to develop more Western styles of cancer, so they tend to get bowel cancer, breast cancer, and other cancers become less common. So some of the more unusual cancers here, like that Burkitt's lymphoma or nasopharyngeal cancer, very rare in Australia, even amongst children of migrants, because it's not really a genetic risk they're carrying, it's an environmental risk that's just obliterated when they move to Australia. So yeah, very good question.
Aside from the influence of genetics, have you any ideas about why young women seem to be getting cancers that previously were more presented in older age?
Yes, look, as I showed you at the very start, there are different patterns of cancer emerging between men and women. So some of the cancers that are emerging in young women, one in particular, not that common, but previously extremely rare, are cancers of the head and neck. And we think this has been caused by HPV infection, so changing sexual practices amongst young people, causing head and neck cancers, which previously we didn't see in younger people. The others can be explained usually by changes in diet, body shape and obesity, and availability or exposure to hormones. So they're the sort of things that have changed from the modern generation. If you compare them back to women 2 and 3 generations ago, those things are very different. And smoking, of course.
Would you be able to give us an estimate, especially for the men in the audience, when consensus will be reached on a definitive test for prostate cancer? It seems to be we're in a limbo at the moment, and it's a very important cancer.
Yeah, I'll have to give you a political answer. We're working on it. It's one of those areas that unfortunately at the moment we don't have a good test. So the prostate-specific antigen it's a blood test, and it's measuring the level of protein in the body, in the blood, and that protein comes from the prostate. So it is true that for many men with prostate cancer that test is positive, but it's also true that for many men with prostate cancer that test is not positive. It's also true that many people have a positive test and they don't have cancer. So it's very difficult to interpret the test. And so until we get a better test, the PSA test itself is never going to be a good screening test. And the problem with the other tests that we have that are really good at picking up the cancer, they're very invasive and painful and expensive to do. So you can't roll them out, in a GP practice. So believe me, people are working on this. It's the holy grail of cancer research to find the perfect PSA test, prostate test, because it will be incredibly beneficial and it will save a lot of money and probably make the inventors a lot of money. So there's a lot of drivers behind this, but at the moment we don't have that test. So I don't think we're ever going to get consensus. Some people are very in favour of the PSA test and others are very opposed to it. And so that's the way it is.